Good evening. My name is Samuel Zorek, and I'm the Secretary of the Rice University chapter of the Federalist Society for Law and Public Policy Studies. On behalf of the other members of the Executive Board, including our President Reed Coleman, Vice President Zachary Birnbaum, PR Officer Anson Fung, Treasurer Jed Greenberg, and Faculty Liaison Nathaniel Asefa, it is a great honor to have you all with us. In exactly 1 week from today, Americans will go to the polls to vote in our next election. They will vote for president, senators, congressmen, and state and local representatives. For many of the students in this room, this is their first opportunity to participate in a national election. The challenges our next elected leaders will face are substantial. America's economy is in decline, our role in global affairs is at a turning point, and polarization is dividing our population. And unfortunately for us as the millennial generation, this is the future that we will inherit. But thankfully, there are still some voices of reason and hope, and we are pleased to have two of those individuals here with us today. Mr. Jared Meyer is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research. His research interests include microeconomic theory and the economic effects of government regulations. He was honored earlier this year by Forbes magazine as a member of the 30 Under 30 list for law and policy. He is the co-author of Disinherited, How Washington is Betraying America's Young, and the author of Uber Positive, Why Americans Love the Sharing Economy. Jared holds a BS in finance and a minor in the philosophy of law from St. John's University in New York. On a personal note, I have read both of his books, and I can attest to the brilliance that Jared demonstrates in critically analyzing some of the pressing policy issues our society faces today. Jared has been so generous as to offer us all free e-copies of his book, so please write your emails on this paper that I will be circulating momentarily, and we'll send you the book along promptly. To deliver commentary and enhance our discussion, we are joined by Professor John Alford from the Department of Political Science here at Rice. Dr. Alford's published work is mostly in the area of elections and voting behavior, with an emphasis on the American Congress, although he has published in areas as diverse as coal mine safety, pro-natalist policy in Eastern Europe, and the genetics of political ideology. His current research focuses on the biology of political behavior. Dr. Alford received his undergraduate degree from the University of Houston and his PhD in political science from the University of Iowa. We appreciate Dr. Alford allowing us to have this event at the same time as his Poly 238 class. I'd also like to take a moment to thank the Baker Institute and the Baker Institute Student Forum for allowing us to use this space. Following our event, we will be co-hosting dinner in the hall right outside here before BISF hosts their annual student debate. I am looking forward to a lively discussion on this election, millennial interests in politics, and the broader future of our great nation. Jared, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Sam, and thanks all of you for coming out tonight on a Tuesday, especially a week before the election, because I'm sure you haven't heard enough about the election yet on TV. Every time you turn it on, that's all anyone's talking about. But I want to focus on something different than what most of the political commentators are talking about. I want to talk about all of you, and me as another member of the millennial generation, and why both parties are trying so hard to bring members of our generation into their folds. But if you look at the numbers, you can see why they're trying so hard to appeal to millennials. 40% of young voters are registered as independents, which is the highest among any age group and the highest going back in recent history for any generation. And you could ask why this is. I think one of the reasons that we're going to dive into further is because neither party really lines up with what millennials want from politics. And I should point out, when I'm talking about millennials, obviously people have a wide variety of views, but I'm just looking at the overall numbers and what I've seen from talking on dozens of college campuses across the U.S. this year. But what we're seeing is that on one hand, during the primaries, there was a clear winner of the millennial vote, Bernie Sanders. He animated young people in a way we really haven't seen since President Obama in 2008. But now that he lost the nomination to Hillary Clinton, we're not seeing the transfer of this support to Team Clinton. And obviously, if you look at the numbers, Donald Trump is not doing well among millennials, to put it nicely. Even looking at a poll a month ago, found that Hillary Clinton won among young voters with 31% support. But coming in second was Libertarian Gary Johnson, just 2 percentage points behind. He was beating Donald Trump. And if you add up the support of Johnson and Green Party candidate Jill Stein, they beat Secretary Clinton by 13 percentage points. So why are millennials flocking to these third parties? And why is the support for Sanders not transferred over to Secretary Clinton when she has co-opted many of the proposals he's pushed, namely extending free college in certain cases? So I think there's a common misconception. I hear this all the time when I'm debating other people, usually baby boomers or the generation even older than them, when they're talking about our entire generation is a bunch of socialists, and that's why we supported Bernie Sanders. But I don't see that as the case at all. First of all, if you look at the numbers, millennials supporting socialism just doesn't work out. If you were to ask a group of young people, do you support socialism or capitalism, the vote is actually pretty close. But if you change the names to a free markets or a government-controlled economy, which are what these two systems traditionally meant when you asked older generations, young people overwhelmingly choose free markets. And why would they not? I mean, I have talked to hundreds of young people, and I still cannot find one person who wants the government to tell Apple how many iPhones they should produce or what features to put in the next iPhone. Millennials simply are not socialists. But they do have strong views on extending certain parts of the welfare state. Healthcare reform is a major concern. But yet you don't see strong enrollment numbers in the Affordable Care Act, a law that President Obama touted as a way to really help young workers. And this is one of the points I like to make when talking about overall why young people aren't lining up as either Democrats or Republicans. Because government policy in many cases is specifically designed to harm young people and help older people. And in the Affordable Care Act, you see this. If we wanted to extend health care to more people, there are a lot better ways to do it than what we did right now, which is make young people pay more for health care in order to keep it at lower costs for people in middle-aged who are in their prime earnings years. And it's right in the letter of the law. So under something known as modified community ratings, a young, healthy person can't pay less than 1/3 of what any other person pays. So this may sound like it's not shifting costs to young people, but before the law, your average person in their 20s was paying about 1/6 of what an average person in their 50s was paying. So the only way to bring this into balance was to raise costs for young people. And if you look at the average premiums on the Affordable Care Act, which has been all over the news lately with many states experiencing double-digit increases in their premiums, you can see that young people are paying for plans that they flat out don't need. And this is why I think when we're looking at the Affordable Care Act, it needs to be clear that one of the ways it was designed to work was to shift the cost of health care from our parents to us. But this is far from the only way that government shifts costs from older workers to younger people. If we look at our entitlement programs right now, you see both candidates, Secretary Clinton and Donald Trump, saying that they're not going to touch Social Security. And in Hillary Clinton's words, she actually wants to expand it for certain retirees. Now, this might sound good, and I know a lot of young people support Social Security in theory, but when you're looking at how the program's designed, it's shifting costs from older generations to us through a series of unfunded promises made by politicians. And the numbers are staggering. We all know that we have about $19 trillion in national debt, but by some estimates, if you look at what we've promised for just two programs, Social Security and Medicare, versus what we're projected to bring in taxes, some people say that we are over $200 trillion in unfunded promises. If we were actually doing accounting like a lot of businesses had to, that could be as high as our national debt is. And this is a big problem because Social Security is not going to be there to the level that is promised when we retire. A lot of millennials, I've talked to them, and they actually think they're not going to get anything in Social Security when they retire. That's not the case. You'll get about 70% of what you're promised under current law, but you have to keep paying into a system that has benefited seniors and is going to harm you. I mean, 15% of every paycheck that you're getting is going right into Social Security and Medicare. And if nothing changes, this could move upwards of 30% by the time we hit our prime earnings years. That's before you pay your federal income taxes, pay your mortgage, pay your state and local taxes, anything else. You're losing 1/3 of your hard-earned income if nothing changes just for these old age entitlement programs. And a lot of people, including Mike Huckabee during the presidential primaries and Bernie Sanders, We're saying that Social Security, it's not an unfunded entitlement, rather it's something that seniors have earned. But you need to look at the numbers, especially for Medicare. For those who retired between 2000 and 2010, they're going to receive between $3 and $7 back for every dollar they paid into Medicare. And that's accounting for potential investment returns if they were allowed to invest that money. So the idea that these are entitlements that seniors need to get because they paid into them, it's simply not true. The whole, I'm not sure if any of you are old enough to remember, but the Al Gore style lockbox is not the case with Social Security. You're paying into a fund. You're not paying into your own private savings account. But to move on from entitlements, I think a major reason why young people aren't enthusiastically supporting either candidate is because they're not focusing on the issues that matter to us. 2/3 of young people want to work for themselves at some point in their careers. There's a reason young people have been called the startup generation. But yet, when you listen to the debates, you would think that 90% of jobs right now are in the manufacturing sector, because that's all Clinton and Trump talk about, is bringing back manufacturing. So they fail to mention, much less emphasize, entrepreneurship. And just to show you with a ridiculous example of how entrepreneurial millennials are, I was in Brooklyn a few months ago, and I saw a shop that only sold pickles for like $7 a pickle. Like artisanal pickles. I don't know this. I talked to the store owner. Apparently he saw a market need, I didn't. But just right down the road, another shop that sold a bowl of cereal for $10. You could customize your cereal. Like you could buy multiple boxes of cereal for that price. But the idea of these hipster capitalists and millennials as entrepreneurs is something that, as I said, neither candidate has embraced. And speaking of something that millennials love, I mean, look at the sharing economy. This is something that is, polls have found millennials across the ideological spectrum overwhelmingly support. Yet you have Hillary Clinton saying that these companies only succeed because they take advantage of workers. And you even had Bernie Sanders during the primary saying, I'm not a fan of Uber, you can quote me on that. I think it's no coincidence that he didn't open his rallies on college campuses with that quote, because young people do love the sharing economy and the independent work that it leads to. So I would like to see, and I think parties, if they would focus on entrepreneurship rather than manufacturing jobs, which are now 7% of U.S. employment, maybe they could do something to get young people interested in their parties. But that's, of course, not been the case. And we even see this extending further into the labor market with things like prohibitions on how long we can work. There's a new rule that came out that Hillary Clinton enthusiastically supports, the overtime rule. If young people are going and starting their careers now, they're not going to be able to put in the work to really build up. And I'm sure we'll be able to go into a lot more specifics on these policies. But I wanted to keep the beginning introductory remarks pretty short and just talk just a little bit more before I wrap up about how millennials view government and why neither party's talking points are really appealing to them. If you look at Republicans, they consistently emphasize tax cuts. That's all they're talking about. But young people really, if they even have a job in today's slow labor market, they're not paying that much in taxes. That's not really a working message for them. The other message that Republicans push is smaller government. We need smaller government. And big government is bad. But we're not scared of things that are big. Our favorite companies, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, these are massive companies that are very big and very involved in our lives. What we want and what President Obama campaigned on was efficient government. So I think that's one reason why Republicans' messages have failed to resonate with young people. Plus, Donald Trump talks so much, you think he would just accidentally say the words sharing an economy next to each other at some point, but he hasn't. He hasn't talked about it at all. And with Hillary Clinton, like I said, she's taken a lot of Bernie Sanders' proposals, but she's failed to gain his support. I could see this as another reason for this failure of a lack of transitioning the support is because young people just want candidates that are authentic. We don't fit nicely into the Republican or Democratic circles, but they want people who are going to be viewed as I said, authentic. This could be one of the reasons why you see a large number of people who supported Bernie Sanders in the primary now supporting Libertarian Gary Johnson when their policy prescriptions are almost opposite on a wide variety of issues. And if you look back to 2012, young people really supported Ron Paul, who was a representative from Texas, who again was almost the exact opposite of Bernie Sanders. But what Ron Paul and Bernie Sanders have in common is they're both cranky old men who just yell a lot when they're giving talks, but also that they are very authentic. That is a word no one would use to describe Secretary Clinton. And Donald Trump, I guess he gives the appearance of authenticity, but if you look at his policy positions, he has changed them. Probably today he's changed them at least. There's a lot we covered, and that's why I'm glad we're going to be able to get into a Q&A and really have a discussion and hear what Dr. Alford has to add to this debate. But I just want to end by saying millennials, they don't fit nicely into the Republican side or the Democratic side. And this is really bothering people in Washington, yet through a variety of policies, the presidential candidates have been failing to emphasize what young people want, especially from the workforce. And I think that's the secret behind why millennials aren't voting enthusiastically this election cycle and aren't registering as either party. So I look forward to hearing what Dr. Alford has to say and diving more into this conversation because there's a whole lot more we can talk about during some Q&A. Thank you.
Well, I'm glad we're getting to talk about policy because, as you're probably aware, that's not been something that's been featured very directly in this election debate over the last 6 months, right? There's virtually no policy at all, so it's fun to say a little something about policy. Now, of course, you're the first speaker, a really bright, energetic young person, and you're bright, energetic young people, and I'm not. And so I'm here to really represent the other side of this equation, and I want to say, first of all, that what he's saying is absolutely true. Right? Old people exploit young people. This is just the way the system works. So I want to comfort you with a couple of ways. One is, often young people lack a sense of history. So historically, this has always been true. So you don't need to feel like you've been singled out as this new generation to be exploited by old people. Young people have always been exploited by old people, usually a lot sooner. So this, just a few generations ago, you'd have all had a good 10 years in a sweatshop by now. Instead, you're actually going to college. So this is not a new thing for the old to exploit the young. And secondly, I think the sort of the occasionally you get someone who reaches out and wants to inspire you, to be all that you can be. And there usually is somebody like Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, all people well past the Social Security age. Right? So it's not as though the leaders who are sort of coming to the fore here as firing up the young people are themselves actually young people. They typically are old people, and you should be rightly suspicious of their motivation. I also want to point out, as I pointed out before in class, there is a reason why your sort of voice is not proportionate to your numbers, and that is because you don't vote. And so, I don't blame you. As I've said before, I understand why you don't vote. If I was young and had the exciting life you have, I probably wouldn't vote either. But on the other hand, you can't complain that you don't have power if you don't actually go out and sort of demand that power. So, old people are really good voters, and they've kind of got that edge on you. And it's an edge they have, I think, sort of across the board. That is, you have something, old people would love to have. You have youth, and they have something that you're not going to wrest from them, and that is power. Right? So that's just, right, that's how this sort of upside down world sort of works. People over the age of 40, 45 have power. There's lots of people who are just getting started in the new economy, have lots of money, but it's not the same thing, right? You can sometimes get some power with money. You can always get money with power. Right? Power is really the ultimate fungible resource. And the way the world is structured, older people have power, and they utilize that power in part to allow you to do what you do so well, which is, support them in their old age. So this is just, right, this is the way these things are structured and always will be structured. And you might want to think twice about inverting part of that structure before you think carefully about what the benefits of it are. So we talked about, there was a discussion about entitlement programs. The value of Social Security and Medicare to young people who are paying the bill for it, right? It's your contributions over the next 20 years that will fund Medicaid and Social Security for your parents' and grandparents' generation. And the value of that is what you're buying there is you're buying their presence somewhere other than your home. Okay, so the idea that young people will have to take care of sick old people is nothing new. Young people have always had to take care of sick old people. They used to literally have to take care of sick old people in their home. That's a very disturbing thing. I'll just mention, just the odor alone is disturbing, right? So you have, through this miracle of a modern economy, you're allowed to basically make extremely large side payments in order to allow old people to live on their own. Not real well, but on their own, and with some medical care that you don't have to physically provide in your house. So before you think, we really should just strip those systems, and you grab back your Social Security and Medicare tax, then think carefully about: do you really want this old person in your house, or do you want them, in some substandard facility, but drawing federal assistance coming out of your paycheck? No question about that. So I think there's something to be said for that. And I think you should also just be, the other thing I think is we often think of our burdens, and I think you ought not to think too much of that. Old people have plenty of time to think about burdens. You don't want to think too much about that. So I don't want you to think, being young and having to sort of carry the entire pyramid of the world on your backs is all such an awful thing. It's really kind of a great thing to be able to do. You're lucky to be in the position to be able to do that. It's your sort of opportunity to serve. You just, instead of serving your country, you're just serving old people. And then again, that's, in the form of, sort of your old members of your own family and other families, and even old politicians like Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, who certainly are not, even by political standards, kind of in the sort of younger range on all of this. So I think there's something to be said for being in that position, and I do think it's you need sort of the perspective that there is, while there's lots that can be addressed in this, and there's certainly over time we've had fluctuations in sort of the degree to which we're stuck with old people versus young people. I think there's always some of that imbalance. On the other hand, I don't think, and Bernie Sanders I think is a great example of this, that even if we're stuck with old people, we don't have to be stuck with old ideas. And so I do think there's a lot to be said for drawing talent and ideas, which is, when people say, I want to surround myself with young, talented, energetic people, what are they saying? They're saying they want to draw energy and talent and excitement from you, and they intend to exploit you, right? They don't mean they want to pay you the same thing they're getting paid. They want to own the company, and they want you to work for them. And so, right, even in that relationship, even when the sort of the best of your ideas become the future of the economy, you're still getting exploited in that process. So we're all biological creatures. As mammals, we spend a period in which we are, as the very young, completely dependent on an older generation, and then you're out there actually doing the work, and then you go into a period which historically, in the broader, our biological history, was extremely short, a very short period in which you were elderly, as in 35 or 40 years old, and then you died. And so now you all look forward to a much longer life, but in that process there's a cost, and ideally it would be shared more evenly. But again, I'm here to represent a generation that currently holds power, has no interest in giving it up, and in part intends to exploit your youth, your ideas, your vigor, and your willingness to not vote. So that's my pitch. Gonna open it up for questions?
Yeah.
You want to field the questions, or
Either way, or
pick
if you
people,
prefer to
whatever?
take them more directly. Yeah, so does everyone agree exactly with what all we said, or do you have some? There we go.
Well, I mean, what I was thinking about is on what Dr. Alford said about young people not voting, and what you were saying about our views not being expressed. For a period of time, I worked on the Kasich campaign. We thought we had a winning message. But part of the issue was that the people we needed to be making the donations, the people we needed to be spreading the message, they were the conservative base. And so that a lot of the oxygen in the room was being taken up, sure, by Donald Trump, but also by Ted Cruz, by Mike Huckabee, by other candidates. I guess my question is this kind of like a chicken and the egg scenario? Is it that we need young people to be voting and donating and involved in activism and organizing for them to matter, and until they kind of show up, I'm wondering, how do you see this sort of political change happening within our system?
Yeah, I think it is. If you look at the history, young people have always voted at lower rates than older people, but I'd say it's a lot worse now, and I'm glad you brought up Mike Huckabee, because if there was an anti-millennial candidate, I think it's him. I don't think he had a single supporter who is not retired. But the problem you see, especially where I would argue, because millennials, they want to be entrepreneurs, their love for startups and what entrepreneurs can accomplish goes far beyond their near universal reverence for people like Steve Jobs. So you would think that economically, millennials are more on the Republican side, not like ideally, not what Republicans are actually pushing, but that's not going to resonate their message, because right now you see a lot of young people completely tuning out the conservative case for economics because you have their views on foreign policy, social issues, and things that young people overwhelmingly reject. So what I found is, while a lot of young people, are skeptical of regulation, in fact, less than 1 in 5 millennials think government regulators have the public's interest primarily in mind, and this has dropped quite a bit, and I would call it even like the Uber effect. When government gets between you and your Uber, like the effects of regulation are very clear. Mm-hmm. So while I would say they tend to be economically, fiscally responsible, their idea of being socially tolerant overweighs that, and that's why you haven't seen really any millennial support for across-the-board Republican issues. As for Democrats, I just think it's because President Obama was so great at appealing to young people, especially in 2008, and got their hopes so high, and then they've kind of been let down, and then going to Hillary Clinton after that is a pretty difficult jump to make. But if you even look at the numbers, back when President Obama took office, 40% of young people thought government was inefficient and wasteful. Today, that's up to 67%. So millennials' attitudes on government has changed a lot, and that's why they really don't feel at home in either party.
I think the two-party system, has to share some of that blame as well. So we're trying to shoehorn a lot into the two coalitions, right? So these are two coalitions that hope to achieve and need to achieve 51% of the vote. So they have to be broad-based coalitions, and that's been disadvantageous to both parties in ways that I think are particularly difficult for young voters. So young voters don't have the experience. When you get to be my age, you're very experienced at compromise. You've done lots of it. But when you're young, it doesn't seem so obvious that life is going to be that disappointing. And so, you actually do want to, you want a candidate that stands for the things you want and doesn't bring with that, a support for, a set of social policies that you think are kind of completely out of date or crazy, or, a view kind of the economy that sounds like it's out of the 1890s or something like that. So right, this sort of broad bundle that gets pulled together, and I think we see this this time I think most clearly on the Republican side, where the bundle is kind of coming unbundled a little bit, but saw it in the primary with Bernie Sanders and Hillary. Is that right? It's hard to put all of that into one party or into one candidate and get to 50%. So young voters might be. I don't know if it's actually true or not, but I think it would be interesting to look at the relationship between relative youth vote and multi-party systems, because I think the overarching kind of compromise that gets forced in the two-party system tends to produce parties that simply have at least some features that young voters are going to find offensive or unattractive.
Yes.
When I talk to millennial voters that are around my age, I repeatedly hear neither of the candidates represent my policies. And it's impossible essentially for one candidate to represent all of your policies. But I don't really hear that when I talk to older voters. So when does that change happen per se, where millennial voters say that the candidate has to be exactly what I believe or I'm not going to vote, whereas when you're older you kind of take some and give some?
Yeah, I'm sure you can speak a lot more to when this happens at a point in someone's life. But what I wanted to focus on, though, is how in the past it's almost like I don't think it's that older voters would have agreed with everything that the party put forward. It's just they become, yay red team, yay blue team. And young people have not done that yet. And I think that's what's worrying people in Washington, is they haven't just picked sides. So if you got a candidate who came and really talked about maybe the millennial American dream, working for yourself, having work that's flexible, individualized, and mobile, like how do we get the innovation seen in Silicon Valley to spread to the rest of the economy, you could make, it wouldn't matter what side of the aisle you were on, young people would get attracted to that. Similar with, I'm an economist, I don't work on social issues or foreign policy, but I could imagine the same thing, where if someone was saying what the vast majority of young people support on those issues, they would, again, it wouldn't matter what side of the aisle they were on. So it's not that older people would have agreed with every policy, it's just that they go along with the party line and they toe that.
And I mean, of course, my view remains, right, part of the aging process is accepting compromise. This is how, eventually you'll get married. This is accepting compromise, right? You like to get everything you want, but you won't. And so, at some point you'll settle for, Bernie Sanders or whatever that image may be. And so I do think, some of that is sort of, is a kind of idealism, right? And a sort of a preference for a system that I think a very admirable kind of preference for doing things better than they've been done. I think that's what motivates so much of a sort of entrepreneurial spirit is rather than seeing something and saying, well, pickles have always been sold in the deli. I want to sell pickles, so I guess I need to found a deli, right? It's just say, I don't, right? I don't want to do that. I just want to do pickles. And so you're just bullheaded enough or inspired enough or idealistic enough to think, well, I can just sell pickles. And, you probably can. So I think so you take that same kind of thing where you look at politics and say, I don't want, you look at politics when you see, right, well, this is great, right? Walmart is running against Target. And Target is saying, we're the young store, we're just like you, right? We're hip. Just like, really? That's it, Target, Walmart, right? So, you just want pickles, you got to go for pickles. But you go to politics, and again, in American politics, with a two-party system, Gary Johnson's a great example. Right, you can't get to 51% that way. You get to 51% by being, Target or Walmart, and not by selling pickles. So, yes.
Hi. You said earlier that millennials are Republican economically, but earlier in your talk you said that that millennials' big issue with Hillary Clinton is not any of her economic policies, but rather her authenticity. And you also said that millennials are very into government social programs like universal government provided and healthcare. How do you reconcile those statements? Oh, and also, how old are you?
Oh, okay. I'm 26. But thanks for giving me a chance to clarify that, because I work on regulation, so I almost narrowly, just single-mindedly focus on regulation. And on that point, millennials are practically like anarchists. Like, they do not see regulation in the same way that older generations did. But if you think about it, just a few decades ago, a lot of regulation in the name of consumer protection, which is what regulation's always pushed in the name of, made sense. Consumers, we were able to control the buying decision, but businesses had the selling decision and controlled a lot of the information about the product. But with things like Yelp, Google reviews, just peer-to-peer online interaction, the information has moved almost fully to the consumer side now. So what a lot of people in Washington, who tend to be a lot of regulators are on the older side, they tend to view as if Google reviews never exist. Like, they don't realize that we're not going to our local government's food safety scores when we're trying to figure out which restaurant to go to. We're going to Yelp. And if you look just on social media, social media alone is almost word of mouth on steroids. If you went to a bad restaurant in the past, maybe you could tell a few friends. Now you can potentially tell anyone in the world. And a story I like to share is, I usually don't like to name names, but Frontier Airlines. I made the mistake of flying with them once, and it was delayed for hours in boarding place. I won't bore you with the story, but pretty much I was tweeting to all my 20 followers about how terrible Frontier is. I'm like, I know it's cheap, but don't do it. It's not worth it. Then Frontier, the people at the gate had no idea when we were going to leave. They were tweeting at me right away, keeping me updated, and afterwards they refunded my flight and gave me a credit enough to fly to Mexico for free. So like that would not have happened 10 years ago. Consumers can hold companies accountable now. Like, of course, businesses are not going to regulate themselves, but consumers have more power to make them behave. So I think when it comes to regulation, that's specifically what I'm focusing on. Millennials in general don't have the strong a view on tax policy, and that's why I think, Donald Trump's trumped up trickle-down economics plan maybe isn't resonating as much. But if he were to go in and, for example, talk about how regulators tend to protect special interests like we see with the sharing economy when they're trying to cut off Uber or Airbnb, maybe then he could communicate a message. So when I'm talking about free markets, I'm focusing overwhelmingly on regulation, and that I hope that helped clarify what your question was. Yes?
I was wondering, kind of going back to the entrepreneurship issue that you were talking about, you mentioned a lot of like the Brooklyn-style hipster shops, but I imagine a lot of those shops, and also especially Silicon Valley startups, are run by very high socioeconomic status educated young people, whereas I would imagine that if you are like of a lower socioeconomic status, you don't have access to education and to capital, then you are going to be more interested in issues that candidates were talking about, like minimum wage and like, getting manufacturing jobs that would pay a decent wage if you don't have a college education. So I'm just wondering, is that argument that you're making apply to all millennials or just to millennials of that special subset?
I'm glad you asked that question because it gives me a chance to bring up my other pet issue, which is occupational licensing. And if you haven't heard of this, it's effectively you have to get the government's permission slip to work because your job poses such a danger to the public that they need to make sure you're qualified. And this extends to things obviously like doctors, lawyers, accountants, florists, interior designers, door repairmen. The list goes on, and now 1/3 of American workers need government's permission to work. Back in the 1950s, again, when consumer protection, there was a greater role for government, it was 1 in 20. Now it's 1 in 3. And this is something where a lot of low and medium skill occupations, they make it prohibitively expensive or time consuming to even start working. An example I like to use is florists. This is a state and local issue, I should point out, and only one state licensed florists, Louisiana. So if the other 49 states in DC can get by without people like horrific stabbing deaths by roses, I think Louisiana should look at their policy. But also, just to show you how kind of the theme of my last book was how government policy favors older, established interests at the expense of new entrants to the market, specifically young people. The pass rate for the Louisiana florist exam is half that for the pass rate of the Louisiana bar exam. So it's twice as hard to become a florist in Louisiana as it is to become a lawyer. Or look at interior designers, a highly skilled occupation, but one that doesn't really pose a public safety. Like, I don't know, I've never heard of anyone dying from mismatched drapes or ugly pillows, but there's 4 states in DC that license interior designers, and it takes an average of 6 years to become a government-approved interior designer. On the other hand, EMTs, emergency medical technicians, they're licensed in every single state, and it takes an average of 33 days. So 6 years for interior designers, like literally holding lives in your hands as an EMT, 33 days. You see a lot of these barriers for low-skilled occupations that then could give the chance to break into the market and start earning a living. Like, that's part of entrepreneurship too. Entrepreneurship, as you pointed out, isn't just these hipster capitalists or people starting companies out in Silicon Valley. The main driver of our growth we see is these small local service businesses that now are facing undue burdens to start working. And I'm glad President Obama actually released a pretty comprehensive report as far as White House reports go, calling for wide-scale occupational licensing reform. And senators like Mike Lee, the Republican from Utah, have been pushing this as well. So I think when this is one area where maybe Washington's realizing we need to stop protecting older established interests, who I should point out are always grandfathered in on these requirements, and open up new opportunities for young people of all skill and education levels to be entrepreneurs. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want to make sure nobody else.
Okay.
I think, though, on that point, though, that there's another layer to this, which is the issue of money in politics, because there's a lot of issues, there's a lot of protected markets that it's very difficult for new entrants to rise up in. But a lot of that seems to be also the result of at least somewhat corruption and influence. So even if parties want to attract young voters more and listen to us more, how much of that is feasible in a system where currently lobbying has a tremendous influence?
I mean, I think, part of this, if you think about how we get into an economy that's structured through things that look like regulation or licensing or entry or sort of guild systems, right, like a taxi cab medallion, things like that, they really reflect an era in which the sort of ability to provide, for the population to provide kind of democratic pressure of individual numbers against economic concentration worked through government. So most of these things, unions are another good example, right? These are where taxi cab drivers are not like the social elite, but they're people who by working with government to create a controlled monopoly, a guild, are able to sort of earn a decent living even though they don't have a lot of concentrated economic power. So that route of using government, using political numbers to get government to give you a wedge into an economy when you weren't part of that concentrated economic power is a very old model and a powerful one, and one that continues to function to some degree today. I think it is also completely outmoded, right? It is almost completely unnecessary. There are lots of alternatives, ways to break through that structure, and you see that with things like restaurant reviews or with things like Uber. So the idea that the concentrated economic power and sort of democratic forces could basically battle each other through a focus on regulation, I think is a sort of an outmoded or outdated kind of conceptualization, and one that's fading, or the one that's disappearing in many areas. On the other hand, the idea that money has a lot to do with what's successful in politics is not something that has or ever will fade. And so I think that's why you see, why does this take so long? And part of the answer is, of course, that not just that old people have a lot of money relative to young people, but that older interests have both a concentrated capital as well as, one of the reasons why florists have to get a license in Louisiana is because if florists have to get a license in Louisiana, then the crooked business of handing out florist license can be one more checkbox on the state legislators. Like, what can I do for you tomorrow? It's like, here's all the things that if you want to be, you'll need to come see me about, right? So it's an extension of a very old system of patronage, and the more, right, well beyond any economic argument, it becomes a kind of a personal, a constituency service kind of argument that you see in Louisiana. Although I would also say, the average lawyer in Louisiana is not as good a lawyer as the average florist is a florist. So there's more than one reason for the disparity of testimonies there. So, but I do think that that issue of, there are a lot of things that can substitute for money, and you see a lot of work in the early Obama campaign and following through into Hillary's campaign, in a Bernie Sanders campaign, to basically turn turn volunteers into money in that sense, right? To be able to substitute enthusiastic young people for wealth, but it just takes one person one person who can throw in $10 million to upset that balance a good deal.
And on money and politics, just really quickly, obviously there's no, AAYP, American Association of Young Persons, to combat the AARPs of, retirees' interests, who they're in the top 1% of political donors every election cycle. And when, for example, President George W. Bush, even though he greatly expanded Medicaid through Medicaid Part D, and it is as a giveaway just to seniors right before the election, he then thought after that, once he won re-election, he could tackle Social Security reform with some very modest proposals. As soon as he started even thinking about it, the AARP pushed all Republicans against him and all Democrats against him. Like, this is something where they're just standing up for their special interests, and they're able to use the money to get what they want. But why you see this in things like occupational licensing specifically is the idea that the benefits of what's conferred, these floral monopolies pretty much, where you have to get government's permission to take flower, put together and sell, is because those people greatly benefit by keeping out competition. Whereas people who want to be florists aren't exactly organized. And if you look at even, just to point out a really stupid program, like how much the U.S. subsidizes sugar to make us pay double what the rest of the world pays. it costs all of us maybe $10 a year. It's economically irrational for us to go and fight to end the sugar program. Yet you have a couple thousand farmers who make millions of dollars every year because we're propping up their crop. So they can spend a lot of time and use a lot of their influence, whereas for the rest of us, it doesn't even make sense. But once all those $10 here, $10 there, lost opportunity here, no path for entrepreneurship there, once all that adds up, I think you see what we're seeing today, where the system is rigged, not in the way Donald Trump's saying, but it's rigged against trying to enter certain parts of the economy without paying an exorbitantly high price.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Okay. In the back.
So the media and media coverage has been especially divisive in this election. So my question is, what role do you see the media having in mobilizing the young vote? And since we're on the topic of innovation, are there any new ways that they can further, help millennials contribute to political change?
Okay. Well, I'll just say this. I don't think the New York Times endorsement of Hillary Clinton's changed a single millennial's mind. That doesn't carry the weight that it used to. And we can see, Donald Trump hasn't exactly been successful at reaching young people, but using different modes of communication rather than just television ads and newspaper media, using these other modes. President Obama really was a trailblazer on that and the first one to successfully do it. And Hillary Clinton, it's just laughable when she tries to do like a Snapchat video or something that she's doing. And like I said, Donald Trump, he uses the media, but not in a way that appeals to young people. Going on Fox News, that's another thing. I don't think any young person really watches Fox News. So it's changing. I really don't have the answers on how to effectively use it to reach young people, but it has to be getting thinking outside the box, kind of like President Obama did, but then taking that 10 steps further because the media landscape's changed so much even since 2008.
Yeah, and I think, part of this is a big change in the way people perceive media. So most of my neighbors who are retired pretty much believe anything they hear from the media. And that was okay, 30 years ago when you really pretty much heard nothing from the media that was interesting anyway. But now there's all kinds of interesting stuff. So they believe all kinds of things. They believe, Hillary Clinton is dying of AIDS, and they have different theories about who she got it from, and they're really pretty stunning when you hear them. And so they're in this. I see they still believe everything they hear in the media, and so they're gullible. And my experience with most younger media consumers is they're quite well aware that you can't believe, you believe pretty much 90% of what you hear over media of any form you don't believe, right? Because you know just how completely permeable it is to just absolute nonsense, and so you're more likely to hear something like that and recognize that it either was a joke or a weird kind of a joke, a mean kind of a joke, and not actually be writing this down to share with your neighbors. And so I think we're at a weird point in terms of the role of media, because we really do have an age divide between people who basically believe too much of a media that doesn't tell them anything true anymore, and people who believe nothing the media tells them. And so neither of those is really the right balance, I think.
All right, we got time for one more. Yes.
You talked about authenticity and how millennials flock to who they perceive to be authentic candidates. But why have we not seen that? And you kind of say that to show that millennials aren't really more Democratic or more Republican. But we haven't really seen that on the Republican side. The two candidates that, like you said, have captivated millennials most have been Barack Obama and Bernie Sanders. So, and I think there have been some authentic Republican candidates. Why are we not seeing millennials really flocking to them?
I would say one thing is there's almost a line in the sand on certain social issues that if you're not on this, like that's beyond the pale. We will not support you. For example, if you don't support equal treatment for same-sex couples, for example. But we saw Rand Paul back before he started running for president was pretty authentic and got a lot of young people's attention. And even the Podesta emails show that Hillary Clinton was very worried about him because he could get much higher youth support than she would be able to get. But then he started running and kind of didn't emphasize criminal justice reform, didn't emphasize drug laws, didn't emphasize how he really just doesn't care about social issues, things like that. And then young people stopped supporting him pretty drastically, as we saw in Iowa. So I think there is a message to be learned there, which is, you can be different and try to reach out to these young people, but then of course you're going to get hammered by the, in the case of Republicans, the national security hawks, the social conservatives. So I feel for these politicians, but there's a way that I'm interested to see if anyone's going to be able to bridge the gap on how to attract older voters who are the ones who are going to show up, but also energize young voters so that they can maybe get back to the 40% turnout, almost 50% turnout I think they had in 2008.
Do you think Rubio might have that potential?
It depends what he emphasizes. I think just being a fresh face would have worked out nice for him, but he was also, the most hawkish candidate running, which a lot of young people, some are fine with that, a lot of people don't view it that way growing up in a perpetual state of war. And on surveillance, he was probably the worst candidate, which is something overwhelmingly young people are against. Our whole lives are online. So that changing on those issues, with how he was open to immigration reform, another thing that a large number of young people support, maybe he could, and he's flip-flopped on so many issues too, that maybe he'll decide to flip-flop in a good way. I'm not sure.
Let's give our two speakers a big round of applause.